Coordination Speaker Series session on housing insecurity. We all see that COVID-19 continues to shine a light on so many that are challenged with housing, both pre and post COVID-19. It is a challenge. It is time for the discussion, and we're so glad you took time to join us today. So let's get started. Carol Jones with HUD. She is the Senior Management Analysis for Housing and Urban Development. She is also part of our Housing Recovery Support Function and our Tribal Working Group for COVID-19 Recovery Operations out of Region 6. And Carol, we're so glad that you're with us today to open us up and provide some thoughts and comments to get us started.
Thank you, Tanya. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for being here for this important discussion. While we all know that many of the issues were present prior to COVID seemed to magnify them. If you will, please take a walk with me. Imagine you are a two-income family making minimum wage, and although you are paying more than 30% of your income into rent, you are able to keep a roof over your family's head. Then comes March 2020 and COVID-19. You both lose your jobs. Now you're concerned about your ability to continue to pay your rent. But hold on, relief comes. There's a moratorium on evictions. Your family is safe for now. Then July 1st comes. Your landlord places an eviction notice on your door. As you all know, you don't have to imagine this. It is the reality of today. And that, my friends, is why we are here today, housing insecurity. To better understand, to identify barriers to resiliency, and as a collective, to brainstorm, problem solve, and to discuss best practices and opportunities to leverage resources. So let's get started. Thank you, and back to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Carol. Today with us to begin this conversation, we have an amazing group of folks sitting on our panel. Todd Richardson is our skilled facilitator. Todd is a senior career official with HUD in the Research and Evaluation Department. Thank you, Todd, for agreeing to spend this time with us and navigating us through this conversation. And with us also is Ian Hyde, the Deputy Director of Argonne National Laboratories. And Ian is going to start the session and provide a foundational groundwork with data. I think, as always, that's a good place to start. Let's be curious about it. Let's dig into it. What do the numbers say? So we'll go directly to Ian. Then Todd will take over from there, and he'll navigate questions and discussions with the 5 panelists with us today. Sound good? Oh, a couple of housekeeping things I should have done at the beginning, I forgot. The session is recorded, and look for the link that will be shared to all of you in the next couple of weeks. If you are in the need of closed caption or sign language interpreter, both of those services are available. The slide you see right now has the links to those. Just cut and paste them in your browser. And if you need either one of those support services, they're there for you. And last, share your thoughts with us in the chat. We will be gathering all of your thoughts, comments, and questions and provide responses to them. We anticipate a second discussion on this topic. Let's hear from you. What are you thinking? And what do you think we need to be talking about? What do you want to talk about as the collective? And with that, let's get started. Ian?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tanya. And first of all, thanks to the entire FEMA Region 6 team for putting on such a great event. Likewise, I want to acknowledge everybody down on the Gulf Coast that is currently dealing with the impacts of Hurricane Laura. We are all thinking about you and hoping for the very best outcome with that. I am going to run through a lot of data in a very short period of time, so my apologies up front if I talk very quickly, but we want to be able to tell a complete story about what the housing picture might look like right now. If we could jump to the next slide, please. So to give you an overview of what I plan to cover, first I'm going to talk a bit about housing prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, we have somewhere between 47,000 and 51,000. And for the state of Texas, an area median income of about 60,000. As we'll see with all of those states, more than 60% of households are owner occupied, whereas anywhere from about 34 to 38% of households are renter occupied. And we'll get into why that's important as well. And then looking across the states, the national median gross rent per month is about $1,023. And in each of the states that we're looking at, anywhere from $723 in Arkansas on up to about $998 a month in Texas. Next slide, please. So let's talk just for a second about what worst case housing needs means. HUD has a report that they put out in 2019 that is incredibly helpful in understanding this issue, but households who might have what we call worst case needs are generally renters. So again, renting versus owning is a very important component of this conversation. They also will likely have incomes at or below 50% of that area median income, which we went through. And in many cases, those that do not have access to housing assistance like Section 8 vouchers and other housing assistance programs. Some of those factors that drive that worst case housing need are when more than 50% of a household income is dedicated to rent, or there's inadequate housing with serious physical problems such as plumbing or heating issues. And within that report, I referenced about 7.72 million households in the United States nationally had what we would classify as worst case housing needs. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about those households with worst case housing needs. A lot of those, again, are very low income renters at 50% of area median income or below. Looking at some of the updates to HUD's report, generally speaking, those very low income households with worst case housing needs rose from 50%, just below 50% to just above 50%. But when you consider some of the factors around physical limitations and otherwise, it's also important to understand those households with disabilities as well. They increased in 2013 from 40% up to roughly 47, 48% in 2017. Next slide, please. So now we talked about rent as a percentage of income, that worst case housing need being 50% of your household income or more to rent. I took a look at the American Community Survey results from the US Census Bureau to try to paint a picture of what percentage of rent based on income looks like in each of the FEMA Region 6 states. In the state of Arkansas, you have about 40% of households that dedicate more than 35% of their income to rent. In Louisiana, it's above 45%. Oklahoma had the lowest percentage of households that contribute 35% or more, just above 35%. And in the state of Texas, just about 40%. Now, not all of these households are worst case need or very low income, but it is an important metric to see how much income is dedicated to rent in each of these states. Next slide, please. Now, the Financial Health Network releases an annual report, the US Financial Health Pulse, and one of the questions that they ask are people's ability to pay bills on time. And it's really a national picture, but I think it is instructive. And it's not just income, but there are disparities across races and incomes as well that are important to understand. So overall, about between 65 and 70% of households said they could pay their bills on time, whereas more than 30% said they had trouble with that. With white households, you have over 70% that are able to pay bills on time and under 30% who have challenges with that. With Black households, you're talking less than 50% who said they could pay their bills on time. With Hispanic households, just above 50%. And then looking at the income, it was roughly 45% who said they could pay their bills on time. Another metric of whether if some sort of event like COVID-19 happens, they'll have the adequate savings or income to be able to cover additional expenses or a loss of employment. Next slide, please. So also taking a look at some of the pre-COVID homelessness statistics. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the statistics for each of the states. In the state of Texas, you had a homeless population in 2019, and this is representative of those who spent at least one night in homelessness of just about 25,000, and the other states somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 persons who experienced homelessness. But I mentioned crowding as a metric. In each of the states, you'll see somewhere from 0.7% up to, in Texas, 1.3% of households where there is more than 1.51 occupants per room. That might look like a small number percentage-wise, but then it's also important to look at the number of households, up to 126,000 households in the state of Texas with that 1.51 occupants per room, and in New Mexico and Arkansas between 8,000 and 9,000. Next slide, please. And also important to understand some of the factors for American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, for tribal populations. The American Community Survey provides some good statistics around poverty in each state, but for American Indian and Alaskan Native populations in particular, they generally face higher poverty rates than the US population at large, significantly higher rates of physical problems, remember the electrical, plumbing, things along those lines, and significantly higher rates of overcrowding. And I went and looked at the poverty statistics in particular. The poverty rate in the United States is about 13.1%. For American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, you're talking closer to 23.7%. And similar stories for African American households at 22%. And Hispanic and Latino alone households about 18.8%. Again, just another piece of the overall story about where there might be housing needs. Next slide, please. And again, talking about housing problems, I mentioned those can be facility problems, overcrowding, or cost burden. And the graphic that you see on the slide is talking about those potential types of problems among the American Indian and Alaskan Native population, which, as you can see, are generally higher than the total US population when you start looking at the specific characteristics there. Next slide, please. So let's talk just briefly about impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic that we've seen so far. Again, I think very important to emphasize that we are very early in this event. And so some of these statistics tell the story of where we are right now, but not necessarily where we are going. We still have a lot to learn. Next slide, please. So from an employment perspective, I wanted to pull some of the top employment industries in each of the states. I think we see some commonalities across states that healthcare and social assistance, state and local government, retail, trade, manufacturing, construction, and accommodation and food services are all fairly frequent top industries in each of the region's 6 states. And we'll get into why that matters in a moment. Next slide, please. So looking at the monthly unemployment rate since the onset of the pandemic, we took a look at February, where for most states, in Louisiana, the unemployment rate was just above 5%. In the state of Oklahoma, it was closer to 3%. And starting in March, you start to see first a slight increase in the state of March, or in the month of March, excuse me, and then in April, a very significant increase all the way up to 15% in the state of Louisiana, about 14.5% in the state of Oklahoma, and that red line showing the national trends. We have generally seen a downtrend in unemployment since then, but it's important to keep our eyes on that. The last couple of weeks, we've seen more than 1 million unemployment claims nationally. Next slide. So this chart just shows the first time unemployment claims since the onset of the pandemic as well. We saw an early influx in the months of March and April, with some slight increases in May and June, potentially related to some increasing infection rates in some states, and gradually trailing down into August. Again, it's still early, so it'll be important to track these numbers moving forward. Next slide, please. And then looking at unemployment by industry, for most of those that I referenced that are top industries in each of the states, we've seen an increase from between 3 and 5% pre-pandemic last July to anywhere between about 7 and 10% currently. However, in the accommodation and food services sector, which is important in many communities, that unemployment rate is all the way up to 23.7. Next slide, please. So the census has put out a household pulse survey that is measuring household experiences on a weekly basis during the COVID-19 pandemic. They're asking questions related to employment status, spending patterns, food security, physical and mental health, educational disruptions, and other factors. One of the questions they ask is the household ability to make monthly rent. The takeaway from the results that we've seen so far is anywhere between 12 and 18% of households in the last few months have been reporting that they had trouble making the previous month's rent payment. Next slide, please. It's slightly fewer households that have a mortgage that are reporting trouble paying, between 5 and 10% generally speaking since the onset of the pandemic, but still a number of households that are struggling to make those monthly mortgage payments as well. And next slide, please. The census also asks about household confidence to make next month's rent or mortgage payment. And as you can see on this slide, 13% of households in Arkansas, 10% in Louisiana, 15% in New Mexico, 5% in Oklahoma, and 9% in Texas all said they had no confidence making the next month's payment. You do have about 36 to 29% between the different states that say they are confident. But this tells a story that a lot of people are worried about making those next month's payments. Next slide, please. And the next slide after that. We're going to want to get to the panel discussion, so I'll just briefly talk about the CARES Act. There was about $2 trillion in assistance allocated in the bill that was signed on March 27, 2020. There's assistance available for small businesses, individuals and families, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and highly impacted industries. And let's look at a few of those resources. Next slide, please. So there are a few important resources. The Coronavirus Relief Fund from Treasury has allocated funding to states, cities and counties, tribes and territories that can assist with any sort of unanticipated budget impacts, including housing needs. You can see on the screen anywhere from $111 billion allocated to states to $7.4 billion dedicated to tribes. There are several programs from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we're so appreciative to have Todd Richardson here moderating this discussion, but looking at those resources as another way to perhaps address or mitigate some of the impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, for small businesses, the Paycheck Protection Program has been an important resource to keep businesses keeping their employees. One last resource I'll call attention to is the unemployment insurance through the CARES Act. Between the March 27th signing of the bill and when those benefits expired on July 31st, about $300 billion in unemployment payments went out. That's the $600 a week to households. That likely helped a lot with housing and potential for eviction and foreclosure, but as those benefits expire, it'll be important to watch and see what happens. So I'm going to leave it there, pass it back to the panel, but I hope that this helps to set the stage. So Tanya, thank you again for having me, and I really appreciate being here.
Todd, it's all yours. Let's get started with the discussion.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you,
Thank
Ian.
you.
All right, so I gave a presentation a few weeks ago to some other folks at FEMA, and I told some dad jokes. It was the only thing anyone liked. So I'll give you one dad joke, and then we'll get into this. So I'm reading a book about anti-gravity. I can't put it down. That's the dad joke. All right. So, so as Ian's presentation shows, and thank you, Ian, there was a housing crisis before the pandemic. And the pandemic has caused severe increases in unemployment, which has been somewhat alleviated our housing crisis a little bit with the unemployment insurance, but that expired at the end of July for the extra bump. So today we also have a new crisis, at least in Region 6 with Hurricane Laura, and we don't quite know what the effects that's going to have. So I'm going to start with some questions for the panel around the pandemic. And then I'm going to introduce the added dimension of Hurricane Laura and other natural disasters and how that plays in with this pandemic. So as Ian noted, there were already homeless households and millions of households struggling to make rent before the pandemic. And we had this dramatic increase in unemployment. So my first question is for Lori, who I know has to leave a little early. How do you see the pandemic magnifying our pre-existing housing crisis?
Thank you, Todd. And I wish I had a mom joke for everyone today, but I'll save that one. But thanks for leading us, Todd. I want to say a couple things about this. So I direct Enterprise Community Partners resiliency and recovery work around the country. And, you know, the COVID epidemic and the subsequent fallout from it has really laid bare the structural inequalities and inequities that have existed pre-COVID from the beginning of this nation's history. So the impacts of disinvestment and racism and redlining that has contributed to a state of vulnerability for many of our communities that we're all serving is really critical to keep in mind, because, you know, we like to say that a household, you know, many households that have sufficient amount of funding, that have resources, are able to deal with COVID in a very different way. And a lot of the communities of color that we serve, that we work for, are dealing with this legacy that has put housing and institutions and the commons in a very vulnerable spot. So when Hurricane Laura has fallen, and there's been many hurricanes that have come before Laura this season, and there will be many following, unfortunately. The way that the hurricane has presented itself to many communities is if a community has been dealing with stormwater management issues to begin with, or lack of affordable housing, or faulty infrastructure that hasn't been well maintained, it's going to put that community at greater risk, for example, than a community that has had sufficient investment, that has had sufficient redundancy built into its budget. So we have to consider what vulnerability looks like right when we start the conversation. And so, you know, this is a big problem, because when we go to look at how do we preserve housing units, we have to consider how do we mitigate risk before, not just after the event. In Louisiana, for example, we know that there's a severe affordable housing shortage. According to colleagues, there's close to 105,000 units of affordable housing needed in Louisiana alone just to deal with the critical need. We also know that a lot of the affordable housing units that have been built, both in Louisiana and across the region, were built in areas of great flood risk, that are built in areas of great risk to heat, and that those situations have not been properly mitigated over the years. We know there are issues. We know there's vulnerability. We need to double down on our investment. I want to thank our great colleagues at HUD and FEMA for having the insight and the foresight to make commitments to investing in mitigation. It's really exciting programs on the street right now, DR-MID as well as BRIC. We need to double down on our investment in communities before risk occurs, because once a storm hits, you're just dealing with repair and triage and losing more affordable housing units. So thank you, Todd, for that question. And I think that, you know, it's a real call to action for our nation to help solve the crisis of inequality and racism and structural disinvestment by doubling down on the needs of the communities that we're serving through appropriate mitigation and resiliency.
Thank you, Lori. Appreciate that answer. I'm going to come back around with some other questions. So if you do hang on, I'll have some more questions for you, Lori. Michael, in respect to what is happening at the local level, are there some lessons that local officials should be considering to help relieve some of the housing challenges when you really think about it at the local level?
Absolutely. And one of the things, so in my role with the ULI Terwilliger Center for Housing, one of the main things that we've been doing lately is trying to track what's happening on the ground at state and local levels to address some of the both acute and chronic needs, many of which Lori was just mentioning. And what we've seen specifically in response to COVID-19 is a relatively, once things shake out, we've seen a relatively narrow set of tools that people have been implementing, but they've been implementing it in a wide variety of ways. So the common toolkit of what we've been seeing is eviction moratoria, direct assistance to households in the form of rental and mortgage assistance. There's been a lot of work to address the needs of unsheltered individuals and families, often through leasing partnerships or direct acquisitions of hotels or motels. And in somewhat rare, but we have seen in some areas, the adoption of rent stabilization rules for this emergency situation. And we've seen all of those examples implemented in a wide range of ways, either directly by local governments. They're either using their CARES Act funding or their own locally appropriated resources if those are available. Sometimes there's a lot of working through a nonprofit partnership or an anchor institution partnership to get those resources out to people that need it. So we've seen a lot of methods of administering these programs, but that general toolkit has been pretty common from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And what the lessons that I take away from this is what seems like it's working best, and time will tell what actually has been most effective. We're learning about this on the fly, but what seems to have worked best is it comes down to fundamentals and getting that baseline foundational work done, much of which you can do in a non-crisis situation, has been effective in serving people's needs. And so the first principle is, I think, the direct household assistance has been critical, because that's the foundation of housing security. So rental assistance in many cases, whether it's provided directly to the household or through working with landlords, has been critical in helping maintain housing stability. And because if you think about it, if you take away that bottom foundation of the pyramid, and then you're also having eviction moratoria or suspensions of different or landlords or housing operators don't have the ability to meet their own obligations, then you have to address interventions at every step up the ladder. So through to the lenders, to the servicers, to the investors. And oh, by the way, many of the investors in multifamily financial products are pension funds, public pension funds, teachers' pension funds, and the like. So the best way, the most direct way to help people with the greatest need is through rental assistance, and in certain contexts, mortgage assistance as well. The other elements that we've seen that have been really effective is making sure you have a robust communication plan. It's been really, there's been a lot of fear out there for a lot of reasons: fear of people getting sick, fear of losing a job, fear of being evicted. So being effective in communicating and finding the right channels to communicate to the people that are in most need of assistance, what is available, and combat some of the mistakes and misinformation that can be available in some cases is really critical. And then the third leg of the stool is capacity building for those nonprofit partners. So we've seen a lot of above and beyond efforts by particularly mission-driven affordable housing providers to make sure that tenants not only stay stably housed, but are able to get access to groceries if they're not able to shop during this crisis, to provide other services, help address the digital divide. Some nonprofits are directly the ones providing the rental assistance to households that are in private market housing. So building the capacity of that sector to be able to reach out and directly help people, I think, is critical. And all three of those things can be done when times are good as well.
Thank you, Mike. That's very helpful. So shifting to Bambi. So Bambi, you're in Georgia. So we can zero in Georgia here a little bit. So private and philanthropic often lead the way on how to address problems. They can come up with creative solutions that might help guide the rest of us. So what have you learned in Georgia that could be informative for all the rest of us?
Good afternoon. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. And although Georgia is not in Region 6, however, we can definitely share some lessons or some lessons learned that we have here in Georgia, especially from our philanthropic community. Georgia Act, we are not a direct service provider. We do policy and advocacy work. We're a membership organization. But it's kind of hard when it's someone in a town such as Little Wissey, Georgia, that doesn't have adequate broadband, that don't have access to scanners and even e-faxes is what we're using now to help even distribute those documents to people. So having those philanthropic dollars that allows nonprofits such as Georgia Act and similar partners to be able to have that flexibility in how we get the money, how we distribute the money, and that helps us get the monies out to those households who need the most help very quickly. And also I want to ditto what Mike said about our nonprofit developers and our mission-based developers. The philanthropic community really comes forward, and there's always more. They've done a great job here in Georgia, but the need is more for the philanthropic community to step in with that gap financing and also to help build the capacity because a lot of our mission-based small nonprofits, they have the knowledge, they have the capacity, but we need, and our members need those general operating dollars. So people are very quick to give money for programming, but forget that those programs need people to run them. And so those general operating dollars that are flexible really would help. And so, you know, I always said, and I said this in a meeting on yesterday with local cities and local governments, you know, you don't have to wait on the federal government. Of course, we do some policy and advocacy, and of course, we're advocating for the $100 billion under the HEROES Act for rental assistance on the national level. But you don't have to wait on the national level. We're looking for cities and counties to begin building and forging those relationships with the philanthropic community. Go ahead and start building your own rental assistance funds. Go ahead and start building your own flexible, low interest or zero interest loan funds that can provide that gap financing to your nonprofit developers. And, you know, then you can use those federal dollars as leverage. So those are some of the things that we have seen here in Georgia with the philanthropic community. But I just want to definitely stress the importance that those philanthropic dollars not just flow into your urban areas, but also your smaller metropolitan areas, as well as your rural and tribal communities, because oftentimes they are left out in those discussions.
Thank you, Bambi. That's terrific. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. Tony, get Tony's up here. Tony, this pandemic has hit some tribal areas particularly hard. One thing I have noted is that overcrowding seems to be a strong indicator of COVID transmission. There's been quite a bit of research on this. And as Ian noted, many tribal communities suffer from a lot of overcrowding. So what are your thoughts about how the pandemic has impacted housing needs in tribal areas?
Sure, thanks, Todd. Thanks for having us as part of the panel here, and appreciate Bambi finishing up there with including tribes coming from Georgia. That's not something I would hear from someone working in Georgia a lot, because there's not a lot of tribal communities there. But I certainly appreciate looking out for Indian country, even on the philanthropic side. I think, as Ian mentioned, the unmet need, I think, in Indian country was clearly there before COVID pandemic came through the country. And then, like everyone's saying, it really just exacerbates and highlights that need to an even greater degree for overcrowded homes. I think the HUD report from 2017 showed that tribes have 16%, or 1 out of every 6 homes is afflicted by overcrowded. So you don't see a homelessness issue in a tribal community like you would in an urban area, but it's because they're bringing in 2 or 3 generations under the same roof. And then when you have COVID or something like COVID come through, it's really going to have a very disparate impact on that community or even on a single household. A lot of our communities are very remote, so I think you didn't really see it right when the pandemic started to come through, and I think, but it's been in the news certainly a lot lately. Navajo Nation is probably the biggest example that everyone's aware of, and in Arizona and New Mexico, just very high rates, and a lot of our tribal communities are afflicted with a lot of the underlying conditions that COVID acts upon even in a greater degree. So it's kind of a perfect storm for when it hits that tribal community. I think the upfront work is trying to make sure that it doesn't get to that tribal community. And I think you've seen efforts to do that. Some tribes in the Northern Plains, trying to set up checkpoints and things to just let people, before they even came into the tribal community, wanting to make sure that they're trying to protect their community as much as they could and keep people safe and healthy. So, but the housing need is acute in Indian country. I think when we talk about how we do that, a lot of the federal funding and the CARES Act have gone a long way. The HUD funding, I think, is almost entirely out the door now for tribal programs. I think as of this week, I think they're releasing some of the final grant awards that came out of that. But that was oversubscribed. I think there was $100 million in community development block grants for tribal communities, and I think there was 2.5 times applications for the amount of funding that was there. So it's still a struggle, and clearly the struggle is finding new development in Indian country, and that's always been the struggle, is acute housing shortage. And I think it's mostly because tribes have been working with about 2/3 the purchasing power that they had back in the 90s. So when they're building new homes every year and then maintaining those homes that they're recently building, we have to invest in that appropriately. And I think tribes are feeling that pinch more and more as we go through levels of funding that they've seen in the last 2 decades.
Thank you, Tony. So now that we've been talking mainly about the COVID pandemic and how that's affected housing, we're going to add in the added dimension of natural disasters. So, Andronika, New Orleans is no stranger to recovering from disasters. I personally have worked on disaster recovery for about 20 years, so I'm deeply familiar with the challenges after Katrina. So do you have thoughts on how we should be managing this dual housing crisis for households that may have could very likely have a long recovery after Hurricane Laura? Thankfully, this didn't hit any of the major population centers, but those areas that were hit, they were hit hard.
That's right. So yeah, thank you so much, Todd, and that's a great question, and I'm glad to be a part of this panel. One of the things that I want to zero in on is the fact that we have not learned the hard-won lessons from previous disasters. Hurricane Katrina, which ironically is going to be commemorated, the 15th anniversary is going to be commemorated in 2 days, as we're dealing with 2 hurricanes hitting within 1 week. Part of the panic, part of the concern the rest of the country has had is around COVID, and how COVID has revealed how unprepared we are as a nation for these kinds of catastrophes. And the concerns that, did we not learn these lessons 15 years ago? Have we not learned these lessons in the past 15 years? And while we are more aware of them, we've heard people talk about the inequities that have been revealed because of COVID. These same challenges were revealed with Hurricane Katrina, and we don't seem to have embraced them as a country and vowed to end them. There have been attempts, but we haven't quite cleared the threshold to the point where we're putting housing first, as we would say here in New Orleans, so that when our leaders call for a shelter-at-home order, when we call for evacuation in response to a major storm, that there are systems in place that will guarantee that Americans and Louisianians and New Orleanians and everybody else has a safe place to shelter. We don't have that in this country. We don't think about this in that way, and it's also very ironic because as we are grappling with a third crisis, our racial inequities with Black Lives Matter, that is also at the heart of our housing challenges. We can't continue to look away from the racial biases that have kept us from dealing with housing insecurity. The fact is when you hear affordable housing in this country, a very specific image is conjured up. And it is of the welfare queen, and that is a poor Black woman with too many children. And that is something that everyone from all aspects of the ideological spectrums, people from all income levels, that is something that they seek to repudiate. That's something that they push back on. We see NIMBY policies and we see resistance to funding these programs, and it's rooted in racial inequity. So what we have to do to deal with all of these crises so we are never caught flat-footed again, so that everyone can recover from this, we have to deal with the racial bias, and we have to commit to housing, to making sure that it's even more than a right, that it's a guarantee that everyone in a pandemic, or even when everything is fine, that no one will go without having a roof over their head for more than what is acceptable period of time. That we have a system that is a safety net that captures all of this, and that when we respond to a crisis, when we respond to a disaster, that is also at the forefront. Where do people live when we talk? And it's a very strange and very peculiar bit of cognitive dissonance when we talk about rebuilding communities. We're talking about homes. When we're talking about getting people the chance to return, we need to be talking about the bricks and mortars and whether or not that is actually an equitable opportunity for all. And we have to now, more than ever, learn from the lessons, these painful lessons that our communities have gone through time and time and time again. We will not get many more chances to fix these problems before the truly disastrous happens. I remember 15 years ago, this country stood up and said they were not going to let New Orleans go. They were not going to let us fall off into the brink. And, you know, I've always been grateful for the response from this country, from the world. When New Orleans was at its lowest, this country said, we won't let you go. But we haven't learned from that. We haven't learned that what we need to do is to prevent that from happening in the future, especially when you look at the recent disasters, what's happening in Puerto Rico, and how we're going to deal with what's happening with Laura and Marco. We still haven't gotten it together so that we can prevent, we can't prevent these storms, but we can prevent the disparate impact. We can absolutely prevent that. And you heard ideas today. Those are ideas that we've all been trying to work on for the last few years. The richness and the depthness of the suggestions offered by my fellow panelists, those are things that they have been working on for years, and we have been unable to really see them systemized.
All right, so Andronika and Lori, you both talked a bit about inequities and how those affect long-term disaster recovery, from whether it's a pandemic or it's the hurricanes kind of disasters. Now, I've done the formula allocations for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program for about 20 years. So when Congress gives extra money for CDBG, I divide it up among the eligible places. And what's a very common scenario we see are two things. This inequity issue comes through both in terms of where you're seeing repeated flooding events, and getting to Lori's point about, say, lack of drainage, an area having lack of drainage, or getting to, just on the housing front, people don't have adequate insurance, particularly flood insurance. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about those two topics, which are what should be the federal government and the state and local governments' best strategy for trying to alleviate those inequities.
I just like to commend my fellow speakers. I'm just really inspired by what everyone talked about, and I want to echo what Bambi said about the need for operation support. I want to talk about something that is really not something often we think about, but how do you, when funding is often provided to communities, it's often provided for the upfront cost of development of housing, of projects that you can cut a ribbon on, that you can break ground, that you can have a sensational an event, and not to underestimate that importance, but there's something to be said for having funding set aside for operations and maintenance. And we see throughout the country again and again how the lack of funding and oversight of operations and maintenance of systems leads to failure, and often critical failure. So I'm thinking about the flooding that has occurred recently in New Orleans around the pumps that are supposed to keep water out of the streets. And because of the lack of funding for maintenance and operations of the electrical systems and the pumps, they fail. We see time and time again that public housing that is funded at the upfront does not receive sufficient funding for operations and maintenance over time. And so what happens? It fails. We build things and we don't maintain them in this country. And this is a real big problem when we get to climate change, because climate change is thrashing our cities and our infrastructure. It is damaging systems that were never built to the conditions that are in place today. We need to be building our infrastructure, our housing, which is infrastructure, I would argue. So Todd, one thing to consider is that housing really should be considered infrastructure and not left out of the pie. We need to think about how do we fund our housing systems so that they will be maintained for generations and will be able to face Cat 3, Cat 4 storms, that they'll be able to face a climate that is changing rapidly before our eyes, and in our lifetime, there may be a point in which we see a Cat 6 storm. Heavens forbid. And so we need to start thinking about the ongoing maintenance of these systems, because we can't keep building and building and building and never and getting into a situation where we don't have enough money to repair this stuff. It's going to fail if we don't commit to a future of sustainability and resiliency.
All right, anybody want to jump in on that?
So yeah, and I absolutely would echo that. And to your question about insurance, one of the things that we have to be thinking about this in a more thoughtful way. The fact is that the National Flood Insurance Program is broken. We keep kicking the can down the road, not wanting to deal with it. And it's exactly what Lori is talking about, our failure to maintain, to invest in the maintenance of this. If something happens and flood insurance isn't available, or if the system continues to implode and to be vulnerable, it won't actually work. And at the same time, we do have to have these hard conversations with low-lying communities about how can they truly be resilient. What does it look like to make sure that that community, which is so rich and so vibrant, that it can stay? What does staying look like? What are the investments that are necessary? What compromises need to be made? Those are conversations that have to be had with community. It's something that, again, we've been making those investments in the equity benchmarks and the equity frameworks, but we've also got to figure out how to have the hard conversations about when a community chooses and works with its leaders to relocate, or it receives investments necessary to stabilize. How do we prioritize that? How do we make that happen? And another thing that we have to talk about is just regular insurance, regular property insurance, and the impact that it has on the market. There are still inequities inside of those systems. And one of the things that we're very worried about here is if we get to a critical mass where a certain number of homeowners and property owners cannot pay their insurance premiums because they've lost their jobs due to COVID, they're receiving less income or no income on rental properties, what does that do to the overall insurance market? What does that do to people who have been able to maintain their insurance? This is a very delicate system, and we are not thinking about that. We're not being strategic as we think about these things. And this is something that FEMA has been able to help with providing information around. But we have got to push our decision makers to truly evaluate all this context. We've got a lot of great data. And our decision makers, particularly at the federal level, have to let that data influence them. They have to educate community, and then we have to come to equitable decisions. One of the things I remember, there was discussion about one of the things that happens routinely is there was a talk 15 years ago about why do we need to rebuild New Orleans? And this country said, and the world said, no, you will rebuild this city. But we need to make sure that when we make those commitments, we rebuild smart. We don't have to reestablish the same inequities. Nobody in New Orleans wanted that. Nobody expected 15 years later, in the billions of dollars that have been spent to save this city, the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested, the hundreds of thousands of man hours, the people who came to help. Nobody expected New Orleans to be almost as bad off as we were 15 years ago when it comes to inequities. And that's what COVID revealed, that we are still just as vulnerable.
Thank you. So I want to talk to Tony a bit. Tribal areas, you've got unique land issues, unique challenges of getting financing, getting insurance in tribal areas. But you also have incredible diversity in the 500 tribal areas across the country, more than 500 tribal areas across the country. So can you give us some examples of places you think that are doing really an exceptional job at addressing issues to improve the housing and make it resilient?
Oh my goodness, you're gonna put me on the spot like that.
Well, you know, Tony, my piece of advice is you can always change the subject.
Right. No. Well, I think your question kind of highlights, how hard it is for tribes, right? And how hard it is for groups, like the other panelists on the call, like federal agencies, to interact with them because there is that such diversity, geographic diversity. Any one state, it's a very small minority or pockets of populations in one or two counties, and it's just not an easy, problem to kind of get your hands around and grapple with and work out in a way that's going to be consistent across all the tribes and across all parts of the country. So it's very difficult. I think where you see success are where you see tribes with tribal leaders, elected leadership, or housing professionals who can really put a plan together to leverage, multiple pots of money, have that network of inviting in kind of philanthropic partners as well. There's a few of the tribes in New Mexico, I think we've highlighted before, and I think HUD has highlighted, you'll be driving through the mountains between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and you'll come around one pass, and there's just 140 home subdevelopment kind of in the middle of nowhere, but it's not the middle of nowhere, it's the middle of the tribal community there that just happens to be between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. So that, where we see that type of leveraging is working well. It's hard to, duplicate that a lot at the same time over all the communities at once. So I think we'll see, 2 or 3 really great projects a year, and that's probably undercounting or just not, giving enough credit where it's due. But it comes and goes in pieces, particularly in different parts of the country. So you'll see and hear one project once, and then you may take a couple of years for that to be duplicative in another tribal community and get all the pieces lined up as it is for that community, because the needs are going to be different. The land issues are going to be different. So, but there's certainly success stories out there. Our job from National American Housing Council is to share those. We try to do that through newsletters and through our conferences. Hopefully we'll be able to have our in-person events soon to where we can share those stories in a lot better way. But certainly getting used more and more to sharing those types of stories through this type of format.
Thank you. So this next set of questions are for mainly Mike and Bambi. Others will be able to jump in too. But I'm going back to the pandemic. And we've been talking about local jurisdictions launching emergency rental assistance programs. And both Mike and Bambi talked about this as important. I was on a call yesterday with the National Apartment Association, and that was from the landlord side of the house. They were they were talking about these rental assistance program, which is also their #1 priority, right? They're trying to make sure that their tenants pay the rent, and they've been advocating for emergency rental assistance as well. So the hard part of this is always implementation, right? And we've got a lot of state and local governments out there of very different capacity. So the question here is thinking about sort of like the 3 things, and Mike, you were getting at this a little bit, but the 3 things, if I'm a local official, what are the 3 things I must do to launch my program effectively?
Oftentimes we look at the larger and bigger nonprofits and we fund them, and that's wonderful and that's great. Georgia Act, we have a lot of our larger nonprofits, but we also have very small nonprofits who have been plunging away at the ground, working with families. They know how to identify those households that need the rental assistance. So really partnering, being more diverse in who you partner with, especially as it relates to working in Black and Brown communities, because a lot of the nonprofits, I know that Georgia Acts members, we do have some small 1 and 2 person nonprofits who are working extremely hard, who are working 14 and 16 hours per day to help families. And so definitely working with those nonprofits that actually have the pulse of the community, especially for marginalized neighborhoods. Again, I cannot stress enough flexibility because I must say that put this out here. I do hold a real estate broker's license and was a former property manager. So I do understand it from the landlord's standpoint. And the key is about housing preservation because not only do we want to keep families in homes, but landlords do not want vacant properties, whether it's a single family home or whether it's an apartment complex, because vacancies cost them money. But also, the third thing is working with our landlords and our apartment owners on healthy housing. You know, we can put all this money out here for rental assistance, but we need to make sure that people have decent, safe, sanitary, and housing that is affordable across the gamut. So people who are, I hate to use the term disabled, that are differently abled, individuals, regardless of their income. So we need more flexibility, more landlords to accept housing choice vouchers, for example, but also making sure that these homes are safe and up to code, because housing is healthcare. And so we need to make sure they're free from mold, free from lead. We saw this a lot. You know, people talk a lot about Hurricane Katrina, but I have lived experience with a natural disaster in Southwest Georgia when Tropical Storm Alberto came through in 1994. And there are communities in Southwest Georgia that are still reeling from the devastating effects of the flooding that sunk Albany State University, and they had to rebuild. And a lot of these landlords that own these properties still have tarps on the houses. If you drive through like the city of Albany, you still see tarps, but people stay there because the rent is, I'm using air quotes, affordable, but they're not really livable. And so now, you know, they need weatherization, they need roofs, they need windows. So, you know, the housing may be affordable, but the utilities are $400, $500, $600, $700 per month. So municipalities are really going to need to take a holistic approach with not only helping our tenants and our homeowners, working with our landlords, but also holding our landlords accountable for making sure that their homes and their units are decent, safe, sanitary, and affordable.
Thank you, Bambi. Mike, got anything to add?
Not much. You covered almost everything that I wanted to say. I think just the main takeaway is having a detailed understanding, if you're a local government, of what your capacity and strengths are, and who, and as Bambi mentioned, recognizing those nonprofit partners and who has the relationships in your community. If you're in an area, like I live in Arlington, Virginia. Arlington has its own rental assistance program throughout just every year, in addition to administering Section 8 housing choice vouchers. Arlington has more ability to directly scale up its rental assistance program, more so than an area that doesn't have a program like that that's already stood up. Another jurisdiction that doesn't have a formal intake process for rental assistance may struggle more and will be more inclined to work through nonprofit partners. And understanding who those nonprofit partners are, and if we're trying to stand something up very quickly, you know, who's already doing some sort of income qualification through, you know, whether it's a community action agency or a food bank, where people are already used to coming don't have people come to you. Go to where people are already going. I think that's one of the main takeaways. And if where people are already going to the local government service agency, that's great. Work through them. If they're already going to a nonprofit, work through them. And when you're trying to stand up these systems as quickly as possible, I think that's the most effective way. And one thing to consider, I would say, is also we talk about working with landlords, and that can be a strong approach too, because you can address, in some cases, hundreds of units and hundreds of families at once instead of one-off applications. But it's also important to consider either the formal rental market in terms of mom and pop ownership, maybe sometimes 1 to 4 unit properties, or the shadow rental market where it's someone just renting a single family home or a room in a home. And what we found, there's actually a really interesting Urban Institute analysis that came out recently that showed that in that 1 to 4 unit rental space, residents of those tend to be lower cost from a rental perspective. The residents tend to be lower income, and residents tend to be disproportionately African American or Hispanic. Interestingly enough, the owners of those properties also tend to be disproportionately African American and Hispanic. So if you're only focusing on the larger scale, professionally managed or potentially national property management company managed properties, then you're potentially having significant impacts on the income gaps and the intergenerational wealth gaps on both sides. So the households that are renting those units may be missing out on assistance, as well as this, because of the disproportionate ownership of those properties among African American and Hispanic households. If those properties fall through the cracks and end up going into foreclosure or suffering maintenance, that can exacerbate some of the wealth gap as well. So I think making sure that shadow market or the more informal market is paid attention to, whatever that looks like in your market, is really critical from an equity perspective.
So I want the folks that are listening to this to start thinking about questions and maybe start writing them into the chat space so we can get you involved in this conversation as well. And I'll try to keep an eye on the chat here. And Tanya, hopefully you can help me with that as well. But Andronika, I saw you nodding a lot with what Bambi and Mike were saying. Are you running an emergency rental assistance program, or does New Orleans have one?
Yes, to both of those questions, the answer is yes. And so the city of New Orleans actually has put out about $5 million, I'm sorry. In April, they launched a program with $500,000 that swelled to $4 million, and they just put out another $1 million. This is mostly CARES Act and some of our Housing Trust Fund money, woefully inadequate. We need about $60 million at least to stabilize all COVID housing insecure renters through the end of the year. We also launched a program with some support from some of our national partners because, like Bambi's organization, Housing NOLA, we're advocates, and we have a 10-year plan to end housing insecurity, and a lot of this is done through policy. One of the things that we wanted to alert people to was the fact that we have a 20% vacancy rate in New Orleans pre-COVID. So we actually have enough room, enough quality homes and apartments and hotels to house all the people who need to be stabilized through COVID, who needed to be stabilized through Marco and Laura, who will need to be stabilized through the rest of the year. And we haven't done this. This is a will problem. It's a failure to prioritize. So our rental assistance program, we wanted to demonstrate the market conditions that Mike and Bambi were talking about, that we could get landlords who don't normally participate in these kinds of programs if you manage it correctly. So what we are doing with our program, what we did in April, was use some of those funds to stabilize, to get homeless families to live in short-term rentals, Airbnbs. And we're paying those landlords who normally made, thousands of dollars a month, we're paying them fair market rent, period. Not the payment standard, the fair market rent for the metro area. And these landlords have accepted this because that's better than zero. We've relaunched an eviction prevention program because the eviction moratoriums had ended. we would have actually seen a swath of evictions this year were it not for this week, I'm sorry, were it not for Marco and Laura and closing of our courts. So what we expect that to resume, if not tomorrow, likely on Monday. So right around the Hurricane Katrina 15th anniversary, we're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of families who haven't already been evicted start to be evicted en masse. And so yeah, this is where this is headed. And so yeah, we launched a new program where community members are going to be donating to help close the gap and to stabilize some families. It's still not going to be enough. The community leaders who are leading the campaign hope to raise about $6 million from individuals and corporate partners. And like I said, they need $60 million to stabilize everyone through the end of the year.
Thanks. Tony, do you know of any emergency rental assistance programs being run with IHBG funds or ICBG funds?
Right. I think a lot of tribes actually utilize some portion of their funds for rental assistance in their communities. I think IHBG and then the HOSTA programs generally are very flexible for tribes in that way. Part of the problem I think is that a lot of the times in a lot of our communities, the tribal housing program is also the housing manager, right? They're not necessarily, just passing through a rental subsidy to someone else to go to a private rental unit. They're actually losing the rent that they would have collected because people are out of work. So the housing program itself is actually being subsidized by the rent that they're collecting from a lot of their community members who are renting the homes that are managed and owned by the tribe. So it's kind of a weird dynamic where the rental assistance would actually help obviously help people pay their rent, but actually shore up a little bit some of the housing services that those housing programs aren't able to provide now because they've lost the rent from people losing jobs and unemployment in their community. So it's pretty like I said earlier, it's probably tribe to tribe on the specifics or details of the program, but a lot of tribes do have some sort of rental assistance programs. And the HEROES Act that we saw talked about in the news had a very substantial tribal set aside. So we were certainly supportive of that program or proposal, and anything like that. I would, if a deal gets struck, we hope to see tribes included in that in some form or fashion, of course.
So Treasury's Coronavirus Relief Fund is being used by a number of jurisdictions for emergency rental assistance. And one thing they can do with those funds and some local funds can be used for this too, that we can't do with CDBG, is it pays individuals directly versus paying the landlord for rental assistance. I'd be curious, since I'm a policy guy, whether folks think that's a good idea to pay folks directly for the rent or pay the landlord directly. Which is the pathway that seems the most likely to keep people housed? So I will let anyone who wants to sort of jump in on that.
I'll take the first stab at that, Todd. So I do think that, again, like I mentioned earlier, we've got to deal with the racial bias. And one of the things that happens is that, especially as we've been talking about unemployment, what is unspoken and often spoken by policymakers when they talk about the unemployment, the COVID unemployment, is there's an assertion, well, they should be able to pay their bills with this money, right? And so I think there has been some resistance to doing the kind of rental assistance that's necessary, because what's implicit in that is they're not spending the unemployment money correctly, right? And it's not even a dog whistle, it's usually a shout. And so we've got to deal with that. And so sometimes there's a hesitancy to do direct payment to tenants because we don't want to get into the conversation about whether or not they spend the money correctly. The best thing to do is to deal with these racial biases, this racial inequity, and dispense with it. I know in our programs we have been doing direct payments just to make it simpler, but we cannot continue this notion of that folks aren't to be trusted with managing their own responsibilities. Our program that we administer, we are also doing wraparound supportive services. And I think that's the piece that's constantly missing in this conversation. If we're going to help folks be stabilized, we also have to help them address their other needs. That might be why a family might use funds that have been allocated to them for housing, or that could be used for housing for other things, because you don't know what's going on in that household, you don't know what their challenges are, and no one is helping them address those problems. So I think there's a really good arguments for both sides, but any argument that is rooted in, again, the welfare queen mythology, that stereotype, is going to be problematic. We've got to dispense with it and move past what's the way to stabilize those, because here's the other thing, landlords have to be held accountable. Bambi talked about this a lot, the quality of the homes and apartments. We cannot be stabilizing people in slums. That can't be happening. And all too often with a lot of the programs, Section 8 and public housing programs, the federal government funds from the federal government are being used to support slums. That has to stop. And that actually, again, that reinforces the stereotype, because guess who gets blamed for that? Not the landlord, not the federal government or the agency that's falling down on their job, the tenants. They are somehow responsible for the quality of the rental unit that they managed to find.
So, Mike, I noticed you nodding. You have something else to add? Thank you, Andronika.
Not much. I'd just say that my general bias is to provide assistance directly to the household. They know what their needs are better than we can tell them for the most part, and whether you should use it for rent or groceries, and that need can change. And what we've seen, especially with the enhanced unemployment assistance early on in the pandemic, and the stimulus payments, is what we saw, that there was a lot of rent that was paid on time, and so people used it to pay rent. They used it to meet their basic needs. And especially when we look at some of those 1 to 4 unit properties, a lot of it depends on your market. If a lot of your rental market is diffuse, and not saying you shouldn't engage with the landlords, but you're just not going to reach landlords at scale. So I would say that in some ways it can be a both and approach, because the benefit of working with landlords, especially of nonprofit affordable owners, is if you know that there's a responsible landlord that is dealing and working to address the needs of a very low income or low income tenant base, then you know that you can have the flexibility and the confidence to provide assistance to them so that they can meet the needs, especially if it's a mission-driven owner. I think that I've seen that working well in practice thus far in some jurisdictions, but really I do think if you're looking at it at scale, aside from some of these maybe perhaps one-offs, that trusting, providing the resources directly to those that are experiencing the need, it tends to be the best solution, even if you have the administrative capacity to make that work.
Hey, Bam, do you want to weigh in on this topic of who gets the money when we provide rental assistance?
Yes, with our rental assistance, we do give the money directly to the landlord. However, we do put stipulations on that so that they can't just take the money and then turn around and evict the family. But also, it does not absolve them of their right to evict the tenant if there's some type of infraction other than non-payment of rent. And so we prefer to make our payments directly to the landlord. But, I agree with Mike. There are other programs here in Metro Atlanta that give the money directly to the family, because the family knows how to utilize and use their money the best. And so in addition to working with the landlords and giving the money directly to the landlords, we've also been working with quite a few magistrate court judges and getting them on board. And so really working having a robust system, again, to keep people housed, but also to make sure that the house is decent, safe, and up to code. And so, working with the code enforcement, working with your magistrate court judges. So we have to look at this from a holistic approach to include those other partners that a lot of people don't talk about, such as judges and code enforcement officers.
So thank you, Bambi. So I'm now gonna turn this over to, well, I'm gonna try to see if we have any questions from the audience here.
Can I throw one out there while we're giving everybody an opportunity? You know, we've spent a good amount of time helping define some of the problems and some of the work going on. But if we start forecasting a little bit, kind of casting that net forward, I'd love to hear, you know, what can we do? If we were to name one or two things, what are the things that the collective, where do we start? And, you know, I don't know, Carol, if you want to weigh in here, and Andronika would love to hear you. I know you've got to hop off really soon, but if I was to say, okay, you're queen for a day, what do we do with all the problems that are out there before us? I'd really love to hear, you know, what's that one thing as we're approaching, you know, almost the end of our time. And again, Carol, join in here, you know, weigh in here. Andronika?
Yeah, so what I would say before I got to go, thank you guys so much, I've got a jet, is if we can put in place a system that and when I say system, and I mean evaluate, a decision-making system that allows us to evaluate whether or not how we're expending money, how we're allocating resources, whether it addresses a short-term COVID housing-related issue or a long-term housing issue. And if it does not, it cannot go towards those things. We do the same metrics with housing, food, health, the priorities, the basic needs need to be addressed. Our leaders have told us that we need to shelter at home, not shelter at hospital, not shelter at work, not shelter at school. Not that those things aren't important, but the fact of the matter is everyone has to have a home right now. They don't have, in order to prevent them from going to the hospital. If their job can't be open, they need to have a house. They need to have housing. And children who are not going to be able to go to school need to learn from home, and we're not prioritizing this that way. So we can put in place that decision-making process that it is inviolate, and you cannot appropriate funds for some vanity project or some need for people who aren't actually struggling, which is what we see time and time and time again. Thank you all so much.
Exactly.
So I will now pass this over to Tanya. Tanya, if you could close us out.
Yeah, I will. You know, as we said when going in, it's a complex conversation, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. And again, we thank each and every one of you for being here. I am going to hand the mic to Jose.
Thank you so much, Tanya, and many thank yous to our leaders of the session from HUD, both Todd and Carol, for opening and facilitating. Thank you, a remarkable job, as well as our panelists, very informed, and not just having a discussion, but offering so many different best practices, as well as recommendations on how we can handle the scenario. And the wonderful comments that were provided in the chat and the questions. FEMA is the one that has hosted this convening of interagency partners, but it's truly an opportunity to bring programs alongside with the concepts and approaches to enhance the resilience across our nation. So it's definitely been an honor to be able to take the lead and to develop venues like this where we can have the conversation. And that is the mission of Interagency Recovery Coordination. It's not just a federal cell. But when you bring different components and stakeholders together, there's miracles that can happen. So I am definitely looking forward to the innovation opportunities that we'll be able to take advantage of in this horrible scenario. But once again, we will take those opportunities. So thank you all.